Hey there, and welcome to the Beginner's Garden Podcast. As a beginning gardener, I remember reading a term that stuck with me over the years. I'm not entirely sure how accurate it is, but it's definitely stuck with me. And it's called the Summer Solstice Weeds Race. Here we are in the middle of June, and the summer solstice is very close to being upon us. And what that means is that those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, we get the longest days of the year. What I took this specific term to mean was that heading up and ramping up to the summer solstice, we would see a profusion of weeds in our garden. Not to say that once the solstice is over, we don't have issues with weeds, because we all know that's not the case. But we notice that they are accelerating as the days get longer. And I would say that that has definitely been something that I've noticed in my garden. We are all going to have to deal with weeds, no matter what our practices are. Even if we have put as many preventative measures in place in our garden as we possibly can, we're going to be dealing with weeds. But one thing that I have noticed, as I hear from so many of you, is that if you are a beginner, or if you haven't made it around to putting some preventative measures in place, you may be dealing with some major weed issues right now. We're going to talk today on the podcast on why this is happening. And partly this is so you will know how to prevent it or how to deal with it in future years. But also, I'm going to talk to you about what you can do about it now. I don't want you to look at your garden and notice that it's all overgrown and just give up, thinking there's nothing you can do about it. Because there are some things that you can do about it this season. And then also understanding the why behind all of this will help you to be able to put some measures in place for next year. So today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about why weeds are taking over and then what you can do about it. Let's take a step back and consider why weeds are taking over the garden. I think this is something that is really important for us to understand, because as we understand the nuances of how nature works, I think it's going to make it easier for us to deal with that. The first thing to understand when we think about why weeds are taking over is that the ground is not meant to be bare. If you have bare soil with no weeds, that's a problem. But if you are dealing with weeds in general, that is sort of a good sign, because nature is trying to cover itself and it has the resources to do so. So just this little mindset might make you think twice about abhorring your weed problem. I mean, not that it's ever enjoyable, don't get me wrong, but understanding that nature, your garden, is doing its job. Now, why does nature not want any bare soil? Why is the ground not meant to be bare? First of all, any kind of growth on the ground is going to help prevent erosion. This is huge. I know as a beginning gardener, I thought erosion was one of those terms that I learned in 5th grade earth science, but what difference did it make to me as an adult? Turns out erosion's a huge deal for us as gardeners, because the most nutritious soil we have in our gardens is going to be our topsoil. It's going to be the top few inches of our soil, and anything that we have planted in our garden, whether we intentionally plant it or it unintentionally grows, in the case of weeds, this is going to help prevent erosion. It's going to keep that topsoil in place. Another thing that different plants will do when they are secured and growing in our gardens, again, whether intentional or whether unintentional, is these roots, most of them, most plant families, there is an exception, but I'm not going to get into all the details of that today. Most plant families, those roots are going to feed fungal networks in the soil. These fungal networks are so intricate that scientists are still studying them. That's such a fascinating thing. Bottom line is, you want these networks in your soil, especially if you're an organic gardener. This is how these plants are going to be fed, in part, is through the fungal networks in the soil. So this is huge. This is why, another reason we really want to have our soil covered at all times in some way. Another thing that weeds in particular can do is they remediate poor soil. It's actually kind of fascinating. If you ever want to go down this rabbit trail, look up certain weeds and how they remediate certain soils. Just off the top of my head, if you see clovers growing in your soil, usually that's an indication that that soil needs nitrogen, because clovers are part of the legume family and their job is to fix nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil. So if you see clovers growing in your garden, that could be a cue to you that the garden is trying to get more nitrogen into the soil. If you see dandelions in your garden, dandelion has a huge deep taproot. A lot of times dandelions are present when you have compacted soil. So that root is trying to decompact. Is that a word? You know what I'm talking about. It's trying to remediate the soil in that way so your soil isn't as compacted. Those are just two very high level examples, but if you look further into this, you'll be able to see that nature is just so amazing in that it's trying to heal itself. So this is the first thing that I want you to see is that these weeds, and especially as we talk about some invasive weeds, those invasive weeds I feel like are kind of outliers, and we'll talk about those in a little bit, but your regular everyday garden variety weeds, they're there because nature is trying to protect itself, take care of itself, heal itself. So if we can look at them in that way, then it may make the whole process a little less like I'm working against something that is threatening my garden. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't mean to paint weeds as these amazing additions to our garden, because when we're cultivating a dedicated vegetable garden or a flower garden, weeds can be problematic. These weeds can choke out the plants that we want, especially if we get aggressive weeds or weeds that get a footing before the seedlings get established. They can definitely hinder the growth of our plants, because one thing they can do is, if you have limited resources, if you have limited water, they're going to definitely suck up some of those resources that your plants need. So we don't really want weeds to be a perennial problem in our garden. So we don't want weeds to be a problem in our vegetable garden because they will steal some of the resources away from our crops. But another thing that weeds can do is they can harbor pest insects. Sometimes if you look at specific insects, if you research any kind of pest control, some of them find shelter in weedy garden areas. So that's another reason we really don't want weeds to be in our vegetable garden. And then honestly, this is something that I think is important to mention, is that depending on your tolerance for how things need to be in order or not, weeds can steal your joy in the garden. And I don't mean to make that melodramatic, but for someone like me who really likes order, weeds they make it where it's just not as enjoyable to garden. Now, if you're the kind of person that, you get a tomato, you're good, and you don't really care what it looks like, then bless you. I wish that I had that attitude a little bit more, because I think it would make me be able to enjoy my garden a little bit more. But if you're like me and you kind of want things to be tidy, weeds can be problematic in that way. And I think it's important for us to recognize what our garden gives to us and as gardeners as well. Now, as I mentioned, some plants, some weeds, some grasses can be invasive. And so I am not singing the praises of them because they are consistently a nemesis for me. Mine is Bermuda grass. When we built our property, we built our house 14, 15 years ago, we were trying to put grass in. We have 3 acres. So my husband bought Bermuda grass seed because that's, what people do around here. And I'm constantly fighting Bermuda grass in my garden now because, and it may have been there before, but I just keep thinking, and then I'll go to the garden center, side note, and I'll see Bermuda grass seeds sitting on the shelf. And I'm like, why in the world would anyone ever plant this stuff? I guess someone who doesn't have a vegetable garden, that's who. But all that to say, Bermuda grass isn't the only one. I know different parts of the country, you have consistent invasive weeds. And so these are weeds that honestly, they're going to be a consistent problem. They will just be something you'll continue to fight. In the case of the most persistent weeds like this, you can look up different ways to be able to get rid of them. I would say most of those efforts are pretty futile unless you want to put some majorly toxic chemicals on your ground, which if you're growing vegetables and you're an organic gardener, that's not an option for you anyway. So I think some of that, you're just going to have to accept that you're going to have to continue fighting them. That's how I am with Bermuda grasses. I know that I'm just going to keep having to fight it year after year, just have to realize that that's just part of it. So the number one thing on why weeds are taking over is that the ground is not meant to be bare. The second thing that could be a problem, and this is something I think beginners especially don't completely understand, but the more that you garden, you probably do, is that tilling can actually and does actually cause the weeds to be worse. Many times what we want to do if we're gardening in a ground bed area is we want to clear that land. And in order to do that, you've got this thick patch of grass or weeds or whatever, and you think the only way to get it into a workable state is to use a rototiller and till that up. Now, we'll be talking about how a one-time till is an option that a lot of gardeners use. I'm going to share with this on the what to do section, but here's what you need to understand about tilling. Is yes, while you're tilling the surface of the soil and you're breaking up the grass and the weeds or whatever is at the surface of the soil, yes, you're breaking that up and you're looking at this bare, beautiful, brown, plantable soil. What you don't see is that weed seeds are in the millions or billions or who knows how much in that soil. And by tilling up the soil, what you're doing is you're bringing the weeds that sat dormant underneath those bottom layers of the soil, and you're bringing them up. And what happens when these seeds are brought up close to the surface is that they're able to sprout, they have access to water, and they have access to sunlight. So your bare brown soil that you just tilled that looks amazing, give it a few days, for sure a few weeks, and you'll find, if you don't do anything, you'll find that the state of the soil will continue to become what you just thought that you took away. Remember, the soil doesn't like to be bare. There's a bank of weed seeds in your soil, and they're doing what they're meant to do. So every time you till it, you're bringing up a fresh crop of seeds. So keep that in mind when you think about tilling. And that's one reason why people that do till, they have to continue tilling, because they have to continue breaking up the new seeds that are sprouting, and it's completely an endless cycle. We're going to talk about what to do if you don't want to till and how that can actually be more helpful in the long run in the what to do section. But let's go on to another reason why weeds are taking over your garden. And this is because you are not mulching. And this could be with tilling or without tilling. Remember, sprouted seeds, when they get to the surface, they are going to have access to light. They're going to have access to water. And if you don't cover the soil in some way, nature's going to figure out a way to cover it for you. Mulching is going to keep most of those small seedlings from even reaching the light to be able to continue to grow. So even if they do get rain and they start to sprout, if they don't have access to light because they're covered with a thick layer of mulch, then they're not going to become a problem. They'll just die because they don't have access to light. So whether you till or you don't, either way, it's so important to mulch your garden, because those seeds that are at the surface are going to sprout without some kind of covering. Now, what if you don't till? Then why are you getting all of these weeds popping up still? Let's say you haven't tilled in ages. Let's say you have a raised bed and you're obviously not going to till that. Why do you keep getting weeds? Well, part of it, depending on the soil, if we're talking about raised beds, part of it could be that there's weed seeds in the soil. And if you use topsoil, garden soil, that happens. If you're using compost that you haven't had a hot composting method and you've got some vegetable seeds that, came from your compost bucket, that happens. But also take in consideration that seeds also blow in on top of your soil. They'll blow in from the wind. Birds will deposit it with their droppings. So even if you have the most weed-free top of your soil, let's say you covered it with compost that's weed-free, it's been hot composted. The compost that I buy in bulk, it does not have any weeds in it. So if I cover my raised bed with that compost, there's no seeds in that compost that sprout. Never has. But the weeds that do sprout are ones that are going to be the ones that blow in. They are not near as much of a problem as when I use topsoil or garden soil that already has a bank of seeds in there. But still, just because you cover with plain compost, that doesn't mean, because compost itself is a method of mulch that some people use, but because it is so fine, it's easy for seeds that do blow in to sprout from that. But if you're covering it with a mulch like wood chips or shredded leaves or straw, those are probably my top favorite ones, then it's going to be really hard for those seeds to be able to take root on top of that mulch, especially if it's thick enough. Another reason that your weeds are a problem is that we talked about how the weed seeds need access to water. And if you're using some kind of a shower irrigation, such as a sprinkler, or you're just watering the entire garden, and you're not just sticking to the roots, the root area, but you're watering the paths, you're probably going to have more weeds. Now, this is also the case if you get a lot of rain. Any of us who get a rain shower, whether we welcome it or not in the spring or in the summer, we can go out there the day or two after and we can see all these new weed seeds have sprouted. It's just the way it works. So if you have a lot of rain, you're probably going to be dealing with more weed problems because it's very common. But if you use shower irrigation and you're watering your whole garden area, then you're probably going to be having a more difficult time with weeds as compared to using an irrigation that irrigates at the plant soil level. If for raised beds, if you're using the Garden in Minutes garden grids, or if you're using drip line, or if you're using drip tape or soaker hoses, all of those methods are on the surface of the soil and the water is coming directly in contact with the soil that you have the plants that are near the plants. So you're not going to have as much of a problem with weeds if you keep that water next to the plant that you're trying to water and not spray it in mass all over your garden. So that could be a problem too, especially if you're growing in a ground bed, especially if you're having trouble with weeds in your pathways. It's probably has part to do with the irrigation. The next reason that weeds may be taking over your garden, and I have definitely been here, it took me a while to actually accept the fact that this was my life, is that your garden is too large to maintain. So many of us have chosen to create gardens that are larger than we can keep up with. And like I said, this is me. And every year I thought, oh, it's just because I fell behind. Oh, I fell behind. I haven't been able to keep up. But when I was noticing that this was happening year after year, and my husband was like, talking to me about different parts of the garden, and I just realized that it was too large. I just couldn't maintain that amount of space. And this, I think, is definitely more of a problem if you have a ground bed. I think with a few raised beds, you're not going to really notice this being as big of a problem. But if you're gardening in ground beds, you may realize that you've bit off more than you can chew as far as maintaining and keeping the weed pressure down. But along those lines, and this is the final point of why you may be dealing with weeds, is that, let's be honest, you're probably or you may not be taking the time to keep up with it little by little. Whether you have a ground bed or whether you have a raised bed, it's going to take some time for you to go out and continue to tend to your garden and get those weeds out. Even in my raised beds that I have brand new soil and I have mulch on top and I'm watering with my Garden in Minutes garden grids, I will have a handful of weeds that I may have to pick every week. But really, a handful of weeds a week for one bed is nothing compared to what I had to do when I had my ground bed. But all that to say, it's really important that you do take time to keep up with the garden and the weeding little by little, because what happens, and it has happened to me, and it's probably happened to many of you if you have had a garden before, is you let it get away from you. And then it becomes this snowball effect where it's really hard to get a hold of. And the thing is too, is that if you're able to get those weeds pulled, whatever method you use, whether you like to hand pluck the weeds or you use a garden tool of some sort, the smaller the weeds are, the easier they are to pull. If you let them get too much of a root or make them get too large, let them get too large, it can be a lot more work compared to if you get on top of them quicker. And we've all learned this the hard way, but just something to encourage you to stay on top of them, especially when the weeds are young. Okay, so we talked about why you may have issues with the weeds, why they're taking over. Now let's talk about what to do. Many of us have had large scale overgrown areas, and this is probably the hardest to deal with because maybe we did create a garden that was too big for us. And we have a whole area that we don't even know what to do with. Now, if you're a raised bed gardener, bear with me. I'm kind of talking to the ground bed gardeners right now. We'll come back to some raised bed tips in just a minute. So if you'll just bear with me or fast forward a few minutes. But I think this is really important for those of you who want a larger garden or you're just growing in a ground bed. You may have an area of your garden that maybe, and this may be something that it's a bare part of your garden. Maybe you plan on planting it later, or maybe you had a spring crop that harvested and you don't have anything planted. but it's overgrown to the point where you're not really sure what to do, but you're willing to take it out of service, so to speak, and not plant anything in it for a while, then you may want to do the option of the cover and smother. And cover and smother, I think I made up that term because I haven't read it before, but maybe it's not mine. I was actually pretty impressed with myself, but you can kind of remember this, cover and smother. The first thing that you would want to do is to mow and or weed eat the whole plot as low as you can. Think scalp it. My husband hates it when I have the weed eater because he says that I scalp everything, which is why he weed eats mostly. But you want to get it as low as you can. After that, you have a couple of options, and I'm going to give you 3 options here. Option number 1 is to cover it with black plastic. This would be a heavy duty, I think I read something like 1,000 gauge, maybe like Visqueen type. Double check me on this just because I've never used it. I'm just going by some things that I've read and heard. But you cover it with black plastic, you secure the sides really well because the purpose is for the sunlight to be occluded and it's not going to get through to be able to nourish those weeds that sprout. This will probably be needed for 2 to 3 months in the hot summer, but if you're doing it in the off season, it could take 6 to 12 months. It kind of depends on how hot your climate is because part of this is not just occluding the sunlight, but it's also covering and cooking the weeds that are already there. So you kind of have both of those going. You're trying to get the soil so hot that the plants are dying because of the heat. They're cooking in it, but you're also keeping the sunlight from reaching any of the newly sprouted seeds so that you don't have any more. What you want to do with this method when you're ready to plant is you don't want to take it off until you are ready to plant. Because remember, principle number 1, your garden, your soil does not want to be bare. So if you take it off before you're ready to plant, even though you have covered, most likely some of those weeds are going to start to sprout again. So wait until you're ready to plant. And then I would recommend to cover the whole area if you can with a layer of compost, maybe about 3 inches thick, because one thing that can happen, especially if you're doing this in the middle of the summer, is that heat can kill off some of the beneficial microorganisms, especially in the top layers of the soil. And so the compost is going to serve to sort of inoculate that soil all over again, to introduce soil life back to your soil. Now, what probably happened if you're thinking about earthworms, they probably burrowed deeper down because of the heat, but they're going to most likely come back up, and then they'll come back up and they'll start incorporating the compost into the topsoil and get it all kind of back in harmony again. That can take, some time, but that's why it's important, or I think beneficial, to cover that area with compost first, just so you can introduce some life into the soil. Now, the drawback of this particular option, covering in black plastic, is it does take time. It takes time to be able to, kill off what you need to kill off. Some people don't want plastic anywhere near their garden. They don't want plastic at all. So if you're opposed to putting plastic in your garden at all, even though you're taking it off before you plant, obviously this isn't the method for you. And again, like I mentioned, it could temporarily kill off soil life at the surface, but that I feel like is temporary. Once you start introducing soil or compost and also plants, your soil is going to remediate. It has this beautiful capacity for healing. So that is definitely temporary. So option number 2, option number 1 was black plastic. Option number 2 is what you may have heard as a lasagna garden method or a back to Eden method. The back to Eden method is what I started using as a beginning gardener, and I really, really like it. So after you have mowed or weed eated the surface, then you would add layers of newspapers, not the shiny newspapers. You want the paper not shiny at all, but you're going to layer those newspapers on top of the soil. I think I like to do about maybe 4 newspaper thick, like thin pages, those 4 newspapers thick, maybe a section of newspaper and spread it out. And then after that, you're going to lay a layer of compost on top of those newspapers. I recommend you not do this on a windy day because those newspapers will blow away. Or if you have to do it on a windy day, have a garden sprinkler or garden hose handy and then wet them as soon as you put them on. Just makes it easier, trust me. But then put a layer of compost and then put a layer of wood chips. Now, how much you put on there really kind of depends on what sources you have handy. The more compost, the better. But I would say, 3 to 6 inches would be good. As far as the wood chips, if you're doing compost and then wood chips, you could probably get a couple of inches of wood chips on top and be okay. I'm not really sure what the official recommendation with Back to Eden is. I haven't researched that in a long time, but you definitely could find that online. But if you skip the compost, which I've done before, because maybe you don't have access to that much compost and you just want to add wood chips on top, then you'd probably want to add more. Now, with this method, you can plant in a few months. You're going to have to wait to plant most likely. Now, the exception to that would be if you have enough compost to create basically a bed where the roots have enough room, at least 6 inches of compost, I would say. Then you could go ahead and plant in it immediately. But if you have less compost than that and then covering with wood chips, then you're probably going to have to wait for a few months to plant. A lot of people will do this in the fall. This is how I started. You do this in the fall and then it should be ready to go in your spring planting. Now, when you plant, if you've got wood chips on top, make sure to pull the wood chips aside when you plant seeds or even when you plant transplants. You don't want to plant in wood chips because the roots are not going to grow in uncomposted wood chips. I made that mistake. That's why I want to make sure to bring that up to you. Make sure you get down to the compost to be able to plant it in that. Option number 3 is one that I tried last year. I actually have a YouTube video on that, and I really liked it. To me, this was the easiest way to do the cover and smother, and it makes it where you can plant right away. And that is the raised row. After mowing everything down, then it's just a matter of building up. Now, you could cover with newspapers. I don't know that I would cover with cardboard necessarily because cardboard takes longer to break down in this particular method, but I didn't cover it with anything. But what I did is I layered topsoil and compost. Basically, I did what I normally do with filling raised beds, and I just filled the area without the raised bed. I think I ended up putting some straw on the bottom, which is a really good source of keeping water retained. So if you have straw, you can put straw on the bottom. You don't have to, that's just what I did. But basically you want to make sure to have topsoil and compost. I think I put 6 inches of topsoil, 6 inches of compost. Can't remember precisely yet, but if you look at the video, you'll be able to see. And you can mix it up. It wouldn't be a problem mixing it up. I like putting my compost on top, partly because I know it doesn't have weeds in it. And what you have there is you just have a ready-made bed to be able to plant in. And then once you plant, then you can add mulch to the top, just like we would normally. Now, one thing that I will say is any kind of invasive weeds or grass will eventually grow into this raised row. Definitely happened. Bermuda grass eventually got into it, but it wasn't a problem for that first season. But it definitely, I'm not planting in it this year, actually. That area is fallow and everything's taking over because the soil doesn't like to be bare. So understand that this may be a temporary option, but if you're wanting to do something this year, then this would be a good option that I really liked. Okay, so we talked about what to do on a large scale, overgrown area. One option was cover and smother. The other one would be a one-time till. You would till to break up the current vegetation. A lot of people like to do this. And then you plant in it immediately, or you don't have to plant in it immediately, and then you cover with a thick mulch immediately, just depending on where you are in your growing season. And then after that, you don't till again. The purpose is to till it once, get it ready to plant, and then add your mulch with or without plants. But the point is to add the mulch, and then every season you continue adding mulch. And this is what I did and have been doing for years. I have not tilled my garden in probably maybe 8 or 9 years, but every year I would have to add more mulch, more mulch, more mulch. Now, as that mulch breaks down, and I used wood chips, weeds do start to sprout, but the key is you have to keep covering it every year. One year I wasn't able to source mulch and I wasn't able to get new mulch, and that's where the weeds started coming up. So you have to cover every year. I would say 3 to 4 inches at least, covering that every year, depending on the type of mulch that you use. But I will tell you that by doing that, even though the weeds do come back to a small degree, they're not anything like they would be what they were when I was tilling. So the key is to continue to mulch so you don't have to mess with breaking up your soil. Now, no tilling is its own subject. We have a podcast episode on that. That's one reason why I don't till, but partly is definitely to keep the weeds at bay. Okay, so that's what to do if you have a large scale area that is overgrown. Let's talk about if you have either a large or small area. This would definitely apply. This will apply to you if you have raised beds. Then you want to weed what you can and then mulch immediately, hoping that you're sensing a pattern here. You can do this if you have plants in the area. You can do this if you don't have plants in the area. But the point is, if you have weeds that are already established, don't just pile mulch on top, because most likely they're going to find their way up. The key is to weed first and then immediately add the mulch. You want to take the weeds out and immediately add the mulch, because remember, the mulch is meant to keep the weed seeds from sprouting, not necessarily to smother the ones that are already there, because the most strong ones are going to get above that mulch anyway. So that's the key. Weed first and then mulch. And then if you have multiple beds, just to make this easier on yourself, just take one bed or one area and do it a day. One thing at a time. And that's usually what I do. If I find that I'm really, behind on weeding, I'll be like, okay, today I am going to do this bed. Tomorrow I'm going to do that bed, and just make it systematic. But I would encourage you to definitely have your mulch handy when you weed, because if you take these weeds out and you don't mulch immediately, you're going to be doing it all over again in a week or two. So it's just going to perpetuate the problem. So get it mulched as quickly as you can. Consider your ability to keep up. This is something that hits all of us gardeners, especially if we're new. Is we think in the beginning of the season that we can do this huge garden, we can do this huge garden space, but many times what we realize in the middle of the summer is that, yes, you're done with the hustle and bustle of planting everything, but then you're starting to harvest, and harvesting itself takes time. Dealing with pests, dealing with disease, all of these things take time. And so a lot of times you don't realize that you're busier than you think this time of year. So consider your ability to keep up and whether you can or not. Ask for help. Ask if there's someone in your family who can help you. Make your kids do it. Pay them. I don't know. Whatever you want to do in your family, get help. Another thing you might consider, which is what I did this year, is downsize. Decide that, hey, this is too much for me and I don't have a way that I can keep up and really enjoy what I'm doing. So I'm going to downsize and not plant as much. That's something to consider for sure. But the method that I have used when I realized that I was having trouble keeping up, well, I did ask for help. My nephew does come over once a week and he helps in some areas in the garden. But the biggest method that I used was converting to raised beds. Every year I've been adding more and more raised beds, because when I control the soil in the raised beds, the weeding is minimal compared to ground beds. And hopefully you've probably gotten that message throughout this podcast. But as you can, if you enjoy raised beds, this is definitely a way to minimize the amount of weeding that you do. I do so much less weeding in my raised beds compared to in my ground beds. Now, some crops are definitely better suited for the ground, and so I do still have a ground plot, but every year I've been taking up more and more of my ground plot and adding raised beds to it, just because it's so much less maintenance. So that would be my final tip, would be if you're finding you can't keep up, consider alternative methods. Ask for help, downsize, or convert to raised beds. The final thought that I will leave with you today is that you are not alone. We all deal with weeds, but there are ways that you can lessen the issue by preventative measures, by making yourself get out there and do it. And I'm hoping that today's episode has given you some ideas of how to hopefully lessen the amount of work that you're doing weeding your garden. Because let's face it, I mean, sometimes pulling weeds can be a little bit cathartic. Sometimes it's enjoyable. but I would rather weed by choice than necessity. And so the less I have to do it, the better. So hopefully this has been helpful for you. As always, I appreciate you coming here to YouTube and watching the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you're ever on the go and you just want to listen, be sure and look for the Beginner's Garden podcast wherever you listen to podcasts on your mobile device. I hope you have a fantastic day and happy summer solstice.